My kids were swimming quietly in our own backyard pool, just trying to cool off on a hot afternoon. No noise, no party, no rules broken. Then an HOA woman stormed up, furious, saying we didn't have permission to use her pool. People tried to explain it was private property. She didn't listen. She called her husband and said he'd handle it. Minutes later, a man claiming to be a cop showed up, demanding my pool keys like he owned the place. Neighbors watched. Phones came out. He acted confident, untouchable. What they didn't know was this: I wasn't just another homeowner, I was undercover FBI. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe for more stories where bullies always lose and the truth comes out. My kids were swimming quietly in our own backyard pool, just trying to cool off on a hot afternoon. The sun was high, the water was calm, and the laughter was soft and contained, the kind that blends into the background of a peaceful neighborhood. There was no music playing, no guests over, no splashing meant to draw attention. Just a normal family moment on a warm day. No noise, no party, no rules broken. I was sitting nearby, keeping an eye on them, enjoying a rare moment where everything felt normal and easy. The pool sat well within our property line, fenced and documented, something we had paid for and maintained ourselves. It was not shared. It was not communal. It was ours. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that, or at least they should have. That calm ended the moment I noticed her. She marched toward the fence with purpose, clipboard tucked under her arm, sunglasses pushed up on her head like a badge of authority she believed no one could challenge. The HOA woman did not wave. She did not greet anyone. She pointed before she even spoke, her finger cutting through the air like an accusation. She said we didn't have permission to use her pool. At first, I thought I had misheard her. The statement was so disconnected from reality that it took a second to register. I asked her to repeat herself. She did, louder this time, explaining that the HOA controlled recreational facilities and that we were in violation. Her voice carried across the yard, sharp and performative, designed to draw attention. Neighbors began to look over. A few stepped outside, curtains shifted. Someone across the street paused mid-walk and stopped to listen. People tried to explain. One neighbor calmly told her the pool was privately owned. Another mentioned property records. Someone else pointed out the fence and the permit sign. She dismissed every word with a wave of her hand. Facts did not interest her. Control did. She said rules were rules, and she was done arguing. When someone mentioned the kids were just swimming, quietly, she snapped back that exceptions create problems. When another neighbor said it was hot and harmless, she said feelings were irrelevant. Her tone made it clear that compassion had no place in her interpretation of authority. Then she pulled out her phone. She did not call the HOA office. She did not call a mediator. She called her husband. She told him to come handle it. Those words alone shifted the energy in the yard. People exchanged looks. Phones came out more openly now. The situation no longer felt like a misunderstanding. It felt like a threat dressed up as enforcement. Minutes later, a car pulled up fast and parked without care. A man stepped out wearing the confidence of someone who believed his presence would end the conversation instantly. He walked straight toward us, not stopping to introduce himself properly, not asking questions, not assessing the situation. He demanded the pool keys. He said he was a cop and that we were done arguing. The way he spoke made it clear he was used to compliance. He expected people to step aside, to lower their eyes, to hand over whatever he asked for simply because he asked for it. He did not notice the cameras. He did not notice the silence. He did not notice how many witnesses were standing just a few feet away. Neighbors watched. Phones stayed raised. No one moved. He repeated the demand, louder, adding that he could make this harder if we didn't cooperate. He looked at my kids and told them to get out of the water. That was the moment the entire situation crossed from irritating to unacceptable. I stepped forward calmly. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I asked him a simple question about jurisdiction. He brushed it off. I asked for a badge number. He flashed something quickly and put it away before anyone could focus on it. I asked why he was enforcing HOA rules instead of city law. His patience thinned immediately. Confidence without substance always does. The HOA woman stood beside him, arms crossed, watching with satisfaction, certain she had won. She believed the uniform, whether real or borrowed, was enough to end this. She believed authority was something you could summon like a weapon. What she did not know was this: I was not just another homeowner. I was not intimidated. I was not unprepared. I was undercover FBI. I had spent years watching people misuse power, borrow authority. Why lean on intimidation when they had nothing else? I knew the signs. I recognized the posture, the shortcuts, the anger that appears when questions are asked instead of obedience given. So I let him talk. I let him demand. I let him reveal exactly who he was and how he operated, all while half a dozen phones captured every second. Then, calmly and clearly, I identified myself. I did not threaten him. I did not boast. I simply stated facts. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. His tone changed. His posture stiffened. His eyes flicked toward the neighbors and the phones he had ignored moments earlier. The HOA woman stopped smiling. The yard went quiet in a way that felt heavy and irreversible. The HOA woman had built her reputation carefully, though not in a way she would ever admit out loud. Around the neighborhood, people knew her as someone who never bent, never reconsidered, and never apologized. She spoke with certainty even when she was wrong, and she relied on volume and repetition to drown out anyone who challenged her. Over time, that strategy had worked. Most residents learned that it was easier to comply than to argue, easier to nod than to push back. She mistook that silence for respect. In reality, it was exhaustion. For years, she had operated in the gray space between actual authority and assumed power. She knew the bylaws just well enough to quote them selectively, and she understood human behavior well enough to know that most people freeze when confronted publicly. She used embarrassment as a tool. She used fear of fines as leverage. And when neither worked, she used intimidation wrapped in official-sounding language. That afternoon by the pool, she was not improvising. This was a routine she had performed many times before. She positioned herself so others could see her clearly. She raised her voice just enough to attract attention without sounding like she was shouting. She used phrases like documented violation and community standards, knowing most people would not ask to see proof. She wanted witnesses, but only passive ones. People who would watch, not intervene. What she did not anticipate was resistance. As neighbors began to question her claims, her expression tightened. Not because she doubted herself, but because her script was being interrupted. She repeated herself rather than responding directly. Repetition was her shield. When someone mentioned property records, she dismissed them as outdated. When another neighbor referenced permits, she claimed the HOA superseded them. Each answer was delivered with confidence, but none were supported by evidence. Confidence can be convincing, especially when no one challenges it. That was why she escalated. Calling her husband was not a last resort, it was her favorite move. In her mind, it ended conversations instantly. A uniform, even tangentially connected to law enforcement, gave her borrowed legitimacy. She had used it before to shut down disputes, to silence questions, and to reassert control when her own authority was questioned. She believed the uniform would do the same thing it always did. While she waited, she paced deliberately, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. She framed the situation as defiance rather than disagreement. She suggested consequences without naming them. She wanted people to imagine worst-case scenarios and retreat on their own. Neighbors exchanged uneasy looks. Some had seen this play out before. Others were witnessing it for the first time. Phones stayed out not because people expected something dramatic, but because instinct told them this moment mattered. When her husband arrived, she visibly relaxed. She stepped aside and let him take the lead, her body language shifting from aggressive to satisfied. In her mind, the hard part was over. The authority she believed she controlled had arrived, and she expected immediate compliance. She did not notice the lack of formal introduction. She did not question why he bypassed basic procedure. She did not care. To her, the outcome mattered more than the method. As he began making demands, she watched the reactions closely. She expected fear. She expected hesitation. She expected surrender. Instead, she saw calm. That unsettled her more than anger ever could. Calm does not fit her worldview. Calm suggests confidence. Calm suggests preparation. Calm suggests someone who is not guessing. When questions were asked, she interrupted. When details were instead, she dismissed them. She attempted to reassert control by speaking over others, raising her voice slightly each time. But something had shifted. The neighbors were no longer passive. They were listening critically. They were watching how her husband responded, not just what he said. She sensed it slipping. For the first time, she realized that her usual tactics were not working. The borrowed authority she relied on was being examined instead of accepted. The uniform was not ending the conversation. It was becoming the focus of it. Her confidence, once absolute, began to crack at the edges. She glanced around and noticed how many phones were pointed directly at them. She noticed people whispering, not nervously, but analytically. She noticed that no one was stepping back. No one was lowering their eyes. No one was moving to comply. Still, she doubled down. She insisted the matter was settled. She claimed non-compliance would be documented. She suggested that things could escalate if cooperation was not immediate. Each statement was delivered with urgency, but not clarity. She hoped pressure would succeed where logic had failed. It did not. As the conversation continued, her husband's responses grew shorter. His certainty weakened under scrutiny. Vague answers replaced confident declarations. The questions were simple, but they were the wrong questions for someone relying on intimidation instead of legitimacy. She felt the control slipping out of her hands. The moment real. Authority was quietly revealed. She froze. She did not argue. She did not interrupt. She did not even speak. Her face shifted from irritation to calculation, as if she were mentally rewriting the situation in real time. The confidence she had walked in with evaporated, replaced by a rigid stillness. Borrowed power has limits. When exposed to the real thing, it collapses instantly. In that moment, the HOA woman was no longer an enforcer. She was just a spectator to consequences she had not anticipated. The authority she believed she wielded was revealed to be hollow, dependent on fear rather than legitimacy. And fear, once questioned, loses all of its strength. The neighbors saw it clearly. So did she. When her husband stepped out of the car, he moved with the practiced confidence of someone who expected the situation to end the moment he arrived. His boots hit the pavement firmly, his shoulders squared, and his gaze swept across the yard as if he were already in charge. He did not ask what had happened. He did not check on the children. He did not speak to anyone, except his wife. And even that exchange was brief and quiet, as though instructions had already been given long before that day. He walked toward the pool gate without hesitation. The first thing many people noticed was how quickly he tried to establish dominance. He stood too close. He spoke too loudly. He addressed the situation with commands instead of questions. These were not the habits of someone there to a misunderstanding. They were the habits of someone accustomed to being obeyed without resistance. He announced that he was law enforcement. He did not specify his department right away. He did not offer identification clearly. He let the implication hang in the air, trusting that the word alone would be enough. For years, that tactic had likely worked. Most people do not challenge uniforms. Most people assume authority is legitimate because it looks official. Demanded the pool keys as if they were his to take. He ordered the children to get out of the water, not with concern but with irritation, as if their presence offended him. The kids froze, unsure what to do, looking toward the adults for guidance. That moment alone shifted something in the atmosphere. Neighbors stiffened. Parents instinctively stepped closer. Phones were raised higher, not discreetly now, but openly. The man noticed the phones, but he underestimated them. He spoke again, louder this time, saying the HOA had jurisdiction and that he was there to enforce compliance. He claimed non-compliance could result in citations or worse. He spoke in vague terms, carefully avoiding specifics. Vague threats are useful when authority is weak. They rely on imagination to do the heavy lifting. I stepped forward calmly. I asked him which department he worked for. He paused for half a second too long before answering. He gave a name but not a badge number. I asked for clarification. He shifted his stance, angling his body slightly away, a subtle defensive move. He told me it was none of my concern. That answer alone told me everything I needed to know. Real authority does not fear transparency. I asked him why he was enforcing HOA rules instead of city law. He brushed the question aside and repeated his demand for the keys. He tried to redirect the conversation back to compliance, back to obedience, back to the space where he felt comfortable. But the questions continued. Neighbors began asking their own. Someone asked whether OA disputes even fell under police authority. Another asked why there was no official vehicle marked with department insignia. Someone else asked why he had not introduced himself properly. Each question chipped away at the image he was trying to project. His responses grew sharper. His patience thinned. He began speaking over people instead of addressing them. He accused us of being uncooperative. He framed basic questions as defiance. These are classic signs of borrowed authority under pressure. The HOA woman stood beside him, arms crossed, watching carefully. At first, she looked satisfied, confident that the situation would resolve itself in her favor. But as the questions mounted and the compliance failed to materialize, her expression changed. She stopped nodding. She stopped interrupting. She started watching instead of directing. The man tried a different tactic. He stepped closer to me and lowered his voice, attempting to isolate the conversation. He's Aid things would go easier if we just handed over the keys and let the HOA sort it out later. He implied that resistance would complicate matters. He suggested consequences without defining them. I did not respond emotionally. I asked again for a badge number. That was the moment the balance shifted visibly. He raised his voice suddenly, accusing me of obstruction. The escalation was deliberate. Loud accusations can rattle people into backing down. They can also expose insecurity when they come too quickly. The neighbors reacted immediately. Someone spoke up and said everything was being recorded. Another pointed out that nothing he had said made sense. A third neighbor reminded him that this was private property. The crowd was no longer passive. It was engaged. He realized he was losing control. His posture changed. The confidence he arrived with gave way to rigidity. His movements became stiff. His words came out faster, less measured. He repeated the same phrases as if repetition might restore authority where clarity could not. The HOA woman attempted to intervene, but it was too late. The situation had moved beyond her control as well. The dynamic she relied on, fear followed by compliance, had collapsed in real time. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was trying to decide whether to push harder or retreat. Pushing harder would mean committing fully to a position he could not justify. Retreating would mean admitting, at least implicitly, that his authority was not what he claimed it to be. Both options carried risk. Now that witnesses and recordings were involved, that hesitation mattered. Real law enforcement does not hesitate when acting within its authority. It explains, it documents, it proceeds methodically. What stood in front of us that day was not that, it was performance. I waited until he finished speaking. Then, calmly and clearly, I identified myself. I did not raise my voice. I did not posture. I did not threaten. I stated who I was, what my role was, and why his actions were inappropriate. I did so in front of everyone, without drama, because truth does not need theatrics. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. His face drained of color. His shoulders tensed. His eyes darted briefly toward the phones, then back to me. He took a small step backward without realizing it. The crowd noticed. The shift was physical, not just emotional. The HOA woman went silent. No one spoke for a moment. The air felt heavy, as if the situation had crossed an invisible line that could not be uncrossed. He attempted to respond, but his words lacked conviction. The certainty he arrived with was gone. He tried to explain himself, to soften his earlier statements, to reframe the encounter as a misunderstanding. But the damage was done. The performance had ended. What remained was accountability. The neighbors did not cheer. They did not taunt. They simply watched as the reality of the situation settled in. This was not about humiliation. It was about exposure, the kind that lingers long after the moment passes. The man realized then that the uniform he relied on had failed him, and for the first time since he arrived, he stopped making demands. He started listening. That change alone told everyone present exactly how this was going to end. The shift did not happen with shouting or threats. It happened in silence, in the space between words, where confidence either holds or collapses. Up to that point, the situation had been driven by volume and posture. Whoever spoke louder believed they were winning. Whoever stood taller believed they were in control. But that afternoon, something different took over. Calm. Not the kind of calm that comes from uncertainty, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand. As the man finished his last demand, his voice sharp and impatient, no one rushed to respond. That pause unsettled him more than any argument could have. He expected resistance or submission. He was prepared for anger. He was not prepared for composure. I did not interrupt him. I let him finish. When I spoke, my voice was even and deliberate. I did not mirror his tone. I did not match his volume. I asked simple questions, the kind that do not accuse but clarify. Questions that require real answers, not posturing. I asked him to explain his authority in this situation. He tried to deflect. He repeated that the HOA had requested his presence. I acknowledged that calmly and asked again that translated into legal authority on private property. The question was reasonable, it was direct, and it was one he could not answer without exposing the weakness in his position. He attempted to regain momentum by reframing the issue as non-compliance. He spoke about cooperation. He warned about escalation. Each word was chosen to sound official, but none of them addressed the question that had been asked. The neighbors noticed. You could feel it in the way people leaned forward slightly. The way phones steadied instead of shaking. They were no longer watching a confrontation. They were watching an examination. And examinations favor clarity, not bravado. I asked another question, calmly and patiently. I asked why he had not identified his department clearly upon arrival. I asked why there was no official documentation presented. I asked why a civil HOA dispute was being treated like a law enforcement matter. He answered none of them directly. Instead, he accused me of being difficult. That accusation might have worked earlier, when fear was still an option. But fear had left the scene. What remained was scrutiny. Accusations without substance sound hollow when everyone is listening closely. The HOA woman tried to interject, but her words fell flat. She repeated phrases she had used many times before, phrases that usually ended discussions. This time, they landed without effect. Her authority depended on people backing down. No one was doing that anymore. Calm has a way of changing the pace of everything around it. The more composed the responses became, the more agitated the man appeared. His movements grew sharper. His explanations became shorter. He repeated himself, hoping repetition might restore control. It did not. Each repetition only highlighted the absence of real justification. I did not rush. I did not corner him. I gave him space to speak, knowing that the more he talked, the clearer the situation would become. This was not about winning an argument. It was about letting the truth surface naturally, without force. Neighbors began asking their own questions, again. But this time they followed the same tone. Calm, curious, direct. No shouting, no insults. Just requests for clarity. Where was the paperwork? Why was this being handled this way? Who approved this approach? The man's confidence eroded with every unanswered question. It became clear that what he had brought to the situation was not authority but expectation. He expected people to move aside. He expected compliance to fill in the gaps where legitimacy was missing. Calm resistance exposed those gaps immediately. At one point, he tried to step back into dominance by raising his voice again. The sound cut through the air, but it did not land the way he intended. Instead of silencing the crowd, it drew more attention to the imbalance between his tone and the situation. Loudness without grounding only amplifies weakness. I waited until he finished speaking again. Then I identified myself properly. Not dramatically, not defiantly, just clearly. I stated my role, my affiliation, and the reason his actions were inappropriate. I did not embellish. I did not threaten consequences. I simply placed the facts on the table where everyone could see them. The effect was immediate and physical. His shoulders dropped slightly, as if the weight of the moment had finally registered. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked again toward the phones, now unmistakably aware of how many witnesses there were. The posture he had arrived with no longer fit the situation. Calm had won. The HOA woman took a step back without realizing it. She said nothing. Her silence was louder than anything she had said earlier. The authority she relied on had evaporated the moment it encountered something more solid than fear. The neighborhood felt different now. People were no longer bracing for escalation. They were observing resolution. The tension shifted from anticipation to certainty. Whatever happened next, it would not be dictated by intimidation. It would be dictated by facts. The man tried to salvage the situation by softening his language. He reframed his earlier demands as suggestions. He claimed misunderstandings. He attempted to reposition himself as someone who was simply trying to help. But calm remembers everything. It does not forget the tone that came before. It does not ignore the threats that were implied. It simply places them in context and lets them speak for themselves. No one argued with him. No one needed to. The moment had already passed. Calm had done what confidence alone could not. It slowed everything down enough for reality to catch up. It stripped away performance and left only truth standing in the open. And truth, once exposed, does not need to raise its voice. It simply waits. That was the moment everyone understood the outcome was no longer in question. The only thing left to determine was how far the consequences would reach. The change did not arrive with a single dramatic moment. There was no loud declaration, no sudden movement, no raised voices cutting through the air. Instead, it spread quietly, like a realization passing from one person to the next. Everyone standing there felt it at roughly the same time, even if no one could have explained it out loud in that instant. The balance had shifted. Just minutes earlier, the situation had been driven by assumption. Assumed authority, assumed fear, assumed compliance. The HOA woman and her husband had arrived believing the outcome was already decided. They expected the neighborhood to fall in line the way it always had. But now, standing in that backyard, surrounded by witnesses and calm questions, those assumptions no longer held any weight. The man who had arrived so confidently now stood still, his body no longer leaning forward, his gestures restrained. He was listening instead of commanding. That alone told everyone more than words ever could. People notice when power changes hands, especially when it happens without force. The HOA woman sensed it too. She had stopped pacing. Her arms were no longer crossed in defiance. She looked around, not at the people she had been lecturing moments earlier, but at the phones, the neighbors, the quiet attention focused on her. For the first time, she was not controlling the narrative. She was reacting to it. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began to speak more openly but not angrily. Their voices were steady, their questions thoughtful. They were no longer afraid of being labeled difficult. The fear that had kept them compliant for so long had dissolved in the presence of clarity. They realized that asking questions was not rebellion, it was responsibility. Someone pointed out how often the HOA had blurred the line between suggestion and enforcement. Another neighbor mentioned previous incidents that had been brushed off or ignored. The stories came out not as accusations but as observations. Patterns were being recognized out loud for the first time. The man tried to interrupt once but stopped himself. He seemed to realize that cutting people off would only make things worse. He nodded occasionally, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. The performance was over. Now he was calculating outcomes. I watched him closely, not with satisfaction but with attention. This was the moment where choices mattered. How someone responds when their authority is questioned tells you everything about whether it was real to begin with. He chose restraint. That decision, small as it seemed, confirmed everything. The HOA woman attempted to regain footing by reframing the situation as a misunderstanding. Her tone was softer now, almost conciliatory. She suggested that perhaps things had been taken the wrong way, but the words did not land, not because they were aggressive, but because they came too late. Misunderstandings do not arrive with demands. They do not arrive with threats. They do not arrive with borrowed authority. The neighbors understood that instinctively. One by one, people stepped forward to clarify facts, property lines, ownership records, HOA limitations. The conversation moved from emotion to documentation, from volume to verification. That transition sealed the outcome. When facts enter the room, intimidation quietly exits. The man realized he could no longer justify his presence in the way he had intended. He shifted from enforcement to explanation, trying to distance himself from the HOA's claims. He said he had been called to assist, not to take over. He emphasized cooperation over command. Every sentence pulled him further away from the role he had tried to play moments earlier. That retreat did not go unnoticed. The HOA woman stood still, her expression tight, absorbing the reality she could not spin away. She had built her influence on the assumption that no one would ever challenge her openly. Watching that assumption collapse in front of an audience changed something fundamental. Not just for her, but for everyone watching. This was no longer about a pool. It was about boundaries. It was about where authority begins and where it ends. About who gets to decide and who gets to question. About the difference between rules and power, and how easily the two can be confused when no one pushes back. The children had climbed out of the pool quietly and stood with the other neighbors now, watching. They did not look scared. They looked curious. They were witnessing something important without realizing it. They were seeing adults handle conflict without shouting, without threats, without force. That mattered. The man finally spoke again, this time carefully. He acknowledged that the situation had escalated unnecessarily. He suggested that everyone take a step back and reassess. It was the closest thing to an admission he could offer without fully conceding fault. No one argued. No one pressed him further. There was no need. The shift had already happened. The authority he tried to assert was gone, replaced by accountability he could not avoid. The HOA woman no longer directed the situation. The neighbors no longer deferred. The outcome was no longer uncertain. People began to lower their phones, not because the moment had lost importance, but because it had resolved itself. The tension eased, replaced by something quieter and more powerful, understanding. As the man prepared to leave, his movements were slower, more deliberate. He did not issue final warnings. He did not threaten follow-up action. He simply stated that the matter would be reviewed and walked away. That exit spoke louder than any entrance could have. The HOA woman followed shortly after, saying nothing, her posture rigid. She avoided eye contact. The confidence she had displayed earlier did not return. It would not return easily, if at all. The neighbors lingered for a while after they left. Conversations continued, not about what had just happened, but about what it meant. People shared similar experiences, connecting dots that had never been connected publicly before. The shift extended beyond that yard, beyond that day. It became collective. For the first time, the neighborhood understood that authority is not something you accept blindly. It is something that must withstand calm scrutiny, and when it cannot, it has no place enforcing anything. That realization stayed. It changed how people interacted, how they asked questions, how they responded to future demands. The fear that once kept everyone quiet no longer had a foothold. The shift everyone felt that day did not fade with time. It became the new standard. And once a community experiences that kind of clarity, it does not forget it. After the standoff by the pool, a heavy silence settled over the backyard. The water rippled gently where my kids had been splashing just minutes before, now abandoned. The pool no longer a source of laughter but a witness to tension. The neighbors who had gathered, phones in hand, began murmuring to each other, exchanging glances that were a mixture of disbelief and relief. No one had expected such a confrontation over a backyard pool, and yet, there we were. The woman from the HOA stood frozen, her previous fury replaced by an uneasy stillness, and her husband, the man who had swaggered in minutes earlier, like some kind of self-appointed law enforcer, had gone pale. The transformation was instantaneous, from confident intimidation to uncertain compliance, and it was mesmerizing to watch. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice calm and even. "Let's make something very clear," I said, addressing both of them and the small crowd of neighbors. "Authority isn't borrowed from anyone. Authority is earned. You cannot come onto someone else's property, demand obedience, and expect no consequences. Not from me, not from anyone with eyes and ears to see what's actually happening." The words hung in the air, and I noticed the HOA woman flinch as if she had never been spoken to like that before. Her husband's hand twitched near his belt, perhaps an instinctive reflex to regain control, but he didn't move. I stepped closer to the pool, kneeling down to pick up a floating toy one of my kids had left behind. "This pool belongs to my family. The property lines are clearly documented. Your HOA rules do not extend beyond your community's limits. Your paperwork cannot override legal property ownership. That's how the law works, and it's something you cannot argue with, no matter how loudly you shout." I looked at the neighbors, making eye contact with several, ensuring they knew the truth and had clarity on the situation. The tension in the air began to shift slightly. The fear the HOA couple had tried to impose was being replaced by quiet relief and curiosity. The HOA woman's lips trembled as she tried to speak. But the neighborhood committee," she began, her voice weak, uncertain, the defiance that had filled her chest moments ago now evaporating. I held up a hand to stop her. "The neighborhood committee does not own property. They do not have the right to enforce laws that don't exist. You may have rules for shared spaces, like community parks or common areas, but this is private property. You cannot claim otherwise, period." Her husband finally spoke, his voice lower now, without the bravado that had carried him into our yard. I was just following instructions. I didn't," he trailed off, the words failing him. I could see the realization dawning, that intimidation only works until it meets someone who holds real authority and knows their rights. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Calm clarity carries more weight than threats ever could. Once the initial confrontation had passed, I moved inside to gather my children. Their eyes were wide but not afraid, more impressed than anything else. "Everything's okay now," I reassured them. "You did nothing wrong. You stayed safe, and that's what matters." They nodded, still shivering slightly from the adrenaline of the moment. Even at their young age, they understood that standing up for what is right sometimes means facing people who think they are untouchable. The next few days were a whirlwind of follow-ups. I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, submitting all evidence, photos of the property lines, recordings from neighbors who had witnessed the standoff, and a detailed account of the events. I also made sure local authorities had documentation in case the HOA couple tried anything similar in the future. It wasn't just about defending my family. It was about preventing this from happening to anyone else. Once the paperwork was submitted, The HOA board quickly realized that any attempt to challenge the property ownership would be a legal disaster for them. They sent a formal letter of apology, carefully worded, of course, acknowledging that they had overstepped. The HOA woman was forced to resign from her position on the committee, her credibility in shambles. Her husband quietly retreated from the neighborhood for several weeks, avoiding any interactions. The power dynamics had shifted permanently, and it was a shift that everyone in the neighborhood could feel. Neighbors came by over the following week, some bringing cookies, others just stopping to offer a quiet smile of support. One of the older neighbors, someone who had lived there for decades, shook my hand and said, "I've seen a lot of conflicts over the years, but never one handled like this. You didn't yell, you didn't threaten, you just stood your ground. That's all it took." I smiled politely, knowing the lesson was clear. Confidence without knowledge is empty. But knowledge backed by calm action is unstoppable. There were also smaller, more subtle changes that became apparent over the following months. The HOA couple stopped attempting to control any part of the neighborhood that wasn't legally theirs. Their previous attempts at intimidation were replaced with avoidance. Any attempt to call attention to themselves ended in polite indifference from the neighbors who had learned the truth. The collective power of knowing your rights, standing firm and acting calmly, had transformed the social dynamic of the neighborhood completely. In the evenings, I would watch my children swim in the pool again, this time without any interruptions. Laughter returned. The water sparkled under the sun just as it always had. The memory of that tense confrontation remained, but it was no longer a shadow over the backyard. It was a reminder of resilience, clarity, and the quiet force of truth. The pool had once become a battlefield, but it was restored to its proper place, a space of joy, safety, and family. The lessons from that day extended beyond property lines and HOA rules. They applied to life in general. Bullies rely on fear and intimidation, hoping no one will question them. But when confronted with calm authority, evidence, and the courage to stand up for what's right, that fear collapses instantly. Real authority is not loud. Real authority does not need to threaten. Real authority simply exists, and when it does, it commands respect naturally. By the time the summer ended, the neighborhood had changed in subtle ways. Conversations about rights, property, and standing up for oneself became more common. Younger families asked questions about what to do if they ever faced similar situations. Older residents nodded, silently acknowledging that sometimes it takes a dramatic moment for everyone to learn the right lesson. I had become, perhaps unwillingly, a teacher through action, demonstrating that knowledge and calm courage always triumph over arrogance and false authority. And so, the pool remained ours, a small oasis of victory and safety. The HOA, which had once seemed powerful and untouchable, had been reminded of its proper place. My children swam, laughed, and played freely, and I watched, proud that they had witnessed something far more important than water games. They had seen firsthand that standing up for the truth, staying calm under pressure, and knowing your rights were skills that would serve them for the rest of their lives. The memory of that day would linger, but not as a source of fear. As a symbol of justice and the quiet, unstoppable force of truth. The bullies had lost, the neighborhood had learned, and our backyard pool was once again just a pool, a place of laughter, learning, and life itself.